Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to a brand new segment on the Sham Sharma Show. This is the Sessions. Sessions is a new segment where I speak to people on the right, on the center, or Hindus on YouTube in a bid or an attempt to create a platform for Hindus and for the right and for the center, wherever you might fall, on YouTube, and to create more of a platform for us on YouTube and to generate more awareness. And to help me do so today, I'm very happy and I'm very privileged to have Shawn Binda from Hindu Lifestyle joining me on the show today. So before I let Shawn jump in, I want to just introduce Shawn and what his channel is all about. So Shawn runs a YouTube channel called Hindu Lifestyle, and please correct me after this, Shawn, if I'm wrong or I've missed anything. But Shawn talks about Hinduism, and he talks about what it means to be a Hindu, particularly what it means to be a Hindu in North America, and what does Hinduism mean, and what does it entail being a Hindu in North America, and things like that. So again, welcome to the show, Shawn.
Thank you for having me on. That's pretty much it. You've captured in sort of one sentence what I hope to accomplish on YouTube is, growing up, being born in Canada, being born in North America, and trying to sort of wrap your head around what does it mean to be a Hindu growing up here in North America, like being physically born in this country. You don't have any sort of like birth ties to either India, Trinidad.
Right.
And sort of like understanding the Hindu experience in the context of a North American lifestyle. And you've captured sort of what I hope to accomplish on my YouTube channel.
All right, awesome. So I'm glad about that. So let's start off with telling the audience, including myself, a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background, and particularly why why you got the idea of starting a YouTube channel, particularly about Hinduism, because I'm actually quite interested to know, because I find the channel very interesting personally.
Yeah. So so I can give you a long answer. I can give you a short answer, but I don't want
give me any answer that works for you. I'm here all evening, mate.
Yes. Okay. So my involvement in Hinduism started from the time I was born. I've been fortunate to grow up in a family. My mom and dad have been heavy sort of basically heavyweights in the Hindu community here in Canada. My dad's been the founding president of the Devi Mandir, which is the mandir that he was a president in, built from the ground up. And since I was born, we've been involved in sort of the Hindu community aspect. When I was young, the mandir experience really shaped my experience about Hinduism. And then as I got older, you have friends in the temple atmosphere. People start to kind of split apart because, life takes over, school takes over. And then as I got older, I realized that, the experience of young people growing up here in North America is a challenging one. And, when I'm in my 30s now, and I realized that when I was growing up, the one thing that I had missing was people that were there to really try to explain everything that was going on in a temple atmosphere, whether it be pujas, whether it be like the Hindu philosophy. So I took it upon myself. I got involved in teaching in our Bal Vikas classes at the temple. And that sort of spiraled into, doing something more. And so YouTube was an avenue that I saw. And you may have noticed this as well when you started your YouTube station, that there's something lacking in sort of young Hindus, being at the center of their own narrative.
Yes.
And I felt that for Hindus growing up here in North America, that there wasn't really anything that targeted us. It's sort of explaining, just Hinduism in general, in not in like a 2-hour long satsang, but something short, something quick, something that people can like watch on their phone
Right.
just to
Exactly.
get that. So that's where the idea came from. Some of the teenagers that I was teaching at the Mandir, they wanted me to start up something, whether it be on Instagram, Facebook, or like anything like that. And I kind of felt that what they were getting me towards was just that experience of having someone that they can relate to and that can explain sort of Hinduism in a modern context, if that's what you want to call it. So I've my involvement in the Hindu community is still there. It's something that I haven't really spoken about yet on my Hindu lifestyle. But this stuff does take time. I want to do a little bit more vlogs so that people can see that I'm not just a guy like standing in front of a camera, but I am involved in sort of the Hindu community here in the Greater Toronto area.
That's really cool, and I picked up on something which I'd love to follow up on a little bit. And you were talking about issues and kind of challenges that Hindus growing up in the West, for example, in North America, let's take for example, face. What would you say would be some issues or some challenges that young Hindus face today, growing up, maybe first generation immigrants, maybe second generation immigrants in the West?
The biggest thing that I've seen actually, and with my own two eyes, is that there really is a lack of people that can explain Hinduism in a way that relates to people here growing up. And I think what gets lost on a younger generation is that there's all these rituals and pujas that are going on in the temple atmosphere, and parents do their best to sort of bring their kids to the mandir atmosphere.
Right.
But there's a disconnect between like performing puja, doing like meditating, and actually really understanding how Hinduism can change your life. And I think mandirs in general sort of have to change the format to attract a younger generation. And this is not something that is a new problem. It has been identified by many people. And that's where I said, what, if I can't be part of the solution, then why am I here for? So that's where I feel that the classes that I've conducted are sort of bridging that gap. Is like, if you have young kids and they're doing arti or something along those lines, like many times going through their head is that I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm just going to do it because my parents told me to do it.
Right.
And just starting off with simple things like that, showing them the reasons why Hindus do the things that they do, makes them appreciate this lifestyle more. So I think what's lacking in the sort of Hindu community are proper teachers that can teach Hinduism, not just from like a pundit or a swami, but teach it as how you would teach history in school. Teach it like a subject so that they understand it, and by understanding it, then it becomes something that they value in their life.
I think that's a very good point, and I think there's another aspect of that where kind of understanding Hinduism comes into being, is that there's a big difference between sort of understanding Abrahamic traditions like Islam or Christianity and understanding Hinduism. I think, in the sense that if you wanted to understand Islam or understand Christianity, there's essentially one book that you need to read. And once you read it, you kind of get the gist of the entire Islamic or Christian worldview and what the whole philosophy is all about. But with India, with Hinduism in particular, the history is so ancient, and the literature is so broad, and the philosophy is so broad and sometimes pretty abstract, and there's so many works as well that somebody can read. I feel like for somebody trying to maybe get into understanding Hinduism better, from just looking at it, from top up, it could be a bit of a overwhelming experience, because there's just so much material out there available. So how would you suggest would be a good way for some novice, for example, let's say a Westerner trying to understand Hinduism, or even a lay Hindu trying to understand his culture better? What's the best way that maybe they can get a gist of our philosophy, but in sort of a simple manner?
Yeah, That is a question that I've been trying to wrap my head around, because many people have asked me. I've actually met a lot of people that come to the mandirs,
Right.
for tours and things like that. And so the first thing that I tell them is that don't expect me to give you a one sentence answer to an ancient tradition that is probably the oldest living civilization to today. It's easy to explain the Abrahamic faiths, but it's not as simple to discuss Hinduism because it is so varied. That being said, how oh man, yeah. So
It's a tough
it's
one.
it is a tough one, and I think that's where a lot of people sort of get stuck, is that it's easy to say, oh, okay, so the first thing that I'm going to talk about are the four Vedas,
Hmm.
but in reality, many Hindus have not even read the Vedas.
Yep.
So then what do you go by? What books do we have? So how I like to start the conversation is I do talk about, Hinduism has started, the four, the four Vedas form the basis of the Hindu tradition. And from that point, our ancient rishis, our ancient swamis, through their own internal spiritual experience, have tried to show us the vastness of the universe through various different scriptures. And depending on your own temperament, depending on your own personality, there's a lot of different ways that you could come to the Hindu tradition.
Right.
And from so I can speak to it from like a Mandir perspective. Many people that I associate with, they focus on basically two sort of texts. One is the Bhagavad, and the other is the Sri Ram, the Ramayana.
Ramayana. Yep.
Yes, and that's something from a West Indian Hindu perspective. That's how many of us come to understand the Hindu tradition. And then from there, then I say, if you want to understand the core philosophy of Hinduism, something that is basically summarized in one book, go to the Gita. And that's sort of how I started off. And I say that, like, don't think that you just have to read one book. It's important that you understand that there are a lot of different scriptures. We don't have one book, and I think that's probably a positive point about Hinduism, is that it is so varied that depending on how you wish to approach it, there is something for you.
No, I definitely agree with that. And if I can shift just a little bit, I find this very interesting because my dad has traveled to the Caribbean a little bit, and he went to Trinidad and Tobago, and he's met a few West Indians there. And he went to this, I don't know if you've heard of this conference that is sometimes organized in Suriname.
Mhm.
It's called the World Hindi Conference. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
And he went there, and he was just completely so fascinated by the West Indians there, and how well they've been able to maintain their culture, how well they've been able to maintain their traditions. Some would say better than some Hindus have been able to maintain them in cities in India,
Mm-hmm.
which I find very fascinating. And talk to me a little bit about how Hindus that traveled so far away from their homeland with no text, no books, none of that stuff, to no technology to maintain or archive what they have, and how they actually maintain it so well.
Yeah, that's something that I've tried to understand from an intellectual perspective. It's really hard to sort of wrap your head around the idea. So that's where I think you have to come at it from an emotional perspective. I think when you're afraid of losing something is when you hold on to it tighter. And for Hindus that left India and went to the Caribbean 170 odd years ago, their identity is innately tied to their religious tradition, the Hindu tradition. And because they're in a foreign land, I think it made them hold on to whatever they could. And I spoke about this a little in one of the videos that I did, is that, like, a lot of the Hindus that came over weren't learned pundits and scholars, like Sanskrit scholars or anything like that. whatever they practiced in the villages is what they brought with them. And that daily practice, just the simple Hindu practice of living their life, doing whatever they could to help their friends and the family, that is what they held on. And I think the Caribbean Hindu, the West Indian Hindu, because they were forced to adapt quickly because of the changes and the hard life that they had to go through under the British indentureship, that in itself forced them to maintain whatever identity they could, because they didn't want to lose who they were. And I think if you compare it, as you're saying, to the Indians in some of like the cities in India, they haven't had to fight for it.
That's
And
very true.
I've had this conversation with a lot of my Indian friends right here in Toronto, where it's like, they look at me, they look at the fact that, yo, you're Hindu, but you don't speak Hindi, you don't do any of that, but you know more about Hinduism and you do more for Hinduism than I've ever done. And I think what that boils down to is that when something surrounds you that you never had to fight for, you take it for granted. Whereas if you have to fight for something, then you value it more. And I think we're starting to see in India right now, which I think goes to like the politics of India, that fighting for your tradition will make you value it more. And we can see that there's now an uprising in India as well, that people are starting to realize that the leftist politics that are going on there is causing people to move further and further away from the tradition of their ancestors. Mm-hmm. And you can see that now there's basically an uprising of Hinduism. And I actually think it may not be the same thing as the Caribbean Hindu experience, but the idea is the same of not wanting to lose the traditions of your ancestors. And I think for Hindus like myself of the Caribbean background, we were put in a situation where we had no choice but to fight for it. Right. And I think that's what caused a lot of us to hold on to it.
I think it's so interesting because when my dad traveled to Suriname, he was completely blown away because a lot of the people that had moved to Suriname had moved from Bihar, which is my native state. Mm. And he was so impressed with, again, how well they had been able to not just hold on to their culture, but make it thrive where they were living. And like you said yourself, and I think that's so true, that a lot of these people were not learned pundits that moved. They moved mainly due to economic conditions and so on and so forth. And when he went there, one of the things he realized was that they spoke the local dialect, Bhojpuri, which is one of the local dialects in Bihar, that they spoke Bhojpuri so well. And they knew all of the the Bhojpuri folk songs that my dad and I, when we go to our villages in Bihar, we sing there. And it's just insane to me and just so fantastic to me that thousands of miles away, these people have been able to hold on to it and maintain it, and and for over, like you said, over 150 years. So that's just so impressive to me. And I want to change tack a little bit again. And I don't know if you heard recently, I think it was last year or something, where there was a judgment in California that a lot of Hindus were celebrating, where I think the court in California ruled that they would be looking at changing the way Hindus are portrayed in textbooks in California. Mm-hmm. And obviously for good reason, Hindus are celebrating that as a big win, because for a very long time in the West, there's a certain way that Hindus are depicted and described, and it is often very inaccurate, and it is often an oversimplification of a very complex philosophy generally. And how are Hindus usually viewed or portrayed in Canada?
So to be fair and to be very frank, some of the other Hindu leaders might disagree with me. I think Hindus generally are not even part of the conversation here in Canada. the Hindu unity that we sorely need here in Canada has been lacking for quite some time. So to talk about how our Hindus are portrayed, to be honest, I don't even think we're on the radar, generally speaking. Whereas if you look at the other faiths or anything like that, you can always see Christian representation. You could see the Islamic representation. There's Buddhist representation, but in terms of sort of like the mainstream sort of life and things like that, Hindus really haven't made a dent. And some people might disagree with me, and I'll be happy to debate any one of my Canadian Hindus watching this here. But generally, like I find in Canadian Hindu society, Hindus have been generally happy to sort of build their own local mandirs and then kind of leave it at that.
Right.
So I'm focused on building mandir in this part of the city. It's going to be 20,000 square feet, blah, 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 and that's great. But in terms of a general sort of like Hindu identity in Canada, like a Hindu presence, I don't know if it's there yet. So in terms from like an academic perspective, I would say it's quite similar to what's going on in the States. I just had a conversation with my class in the morning about, for students that are in high school right now that are going into university, be very mindful of, if you take a religion course, and they start talking about Hinduism, find out, well, who wrote this book? And then look into the author and then kind of figure out, from what point of view are they sort of coming in and talking about Hinduism? Because you yourself would know, that the portrayal of Hindus in the academic side, in the media side, is skewed towards, that sort of view that Hindus are, like, talk about caste, and they want to talk about curry, and they want to talk about cows. So, like those three things are sort of how everything sort of gets framed. I really think that here in Canada, Hindus now need to start, they've built their temples, which is great, because I think that forms the base. Where we need to move now is start tackling mainstream society. How can our voice be heard? I followed quite closely, like organizations like the Hindu American Foundation and the work they're doing, and like we really don't have anything like that. They're now, whatever like people feel about the Hindu American Foundation is fine, but at least there's organizations that have rallied to sort of make sure that there is a Hindu voice. Canada has tried, and I've been part of efforts too to kind of bring Hindus from all walks of life, and everything just kind of goes up in smoke. And I think, like Hindu unity is something that is very elusive. It's very elusive, and I can't understand why.
It's a very interesting thing, because it's something that has long been a bane of Hindus, is unity. Even if you look at Indian history over the ages, India has always, or Hindus have always been a very strong and a very resilient people. What's often led to their downfall is infighting and just not being able to present a united front. And that's something that's hurt India, post-independence as well. And I feel like, in so-called the modern age, a lot of that has to do with education, at least from India, from what I can tell. It has a lot to do with education, because I remember when I was in school, early school, middle school, high school, every single history class, whenever a Hindu civilization was mentioned, it was just, okay, this was the Hindu civilization. So, for example, one of the greatest Hindu civilizations to ever exist, the Mauryas, for example, and there's about a page on the Mauryas in history textbooks in India. And for somebody like Akbar or Jahangir, Babur, and all of those folks, all of those people get their own chapters.
Yeah.
And great civilizations like the Mauryas get like one paragraph or one page, and the most things that will be talked about in history textbooks is caste, and how caste is this immutable truth of Hindu society, which is, couldn't be further from the truth. And how, caste is responsible for the position that Hindu society is in today. And it's just, caste is something that's just used by politicians in India all the time as well. And I feel like that's something that's just communicated to the West as well. And the West just picks that up and runs with it. And it's just that whenever the West thinks of Hindus, they think of, like you said, cows, and then they think of the caste system. And that's what it's all about. And I feel like at some level, once you've been force-fed that for generations, at some level you will internalize it. And I feel like Hindus to some level have internalized, and there have been generations, my dad's generation, my generation, a lot of my, I went to university in Delhi University, and Delhi University is one of those, big bastions of liberalism in India. And a lot of those students that I studied with have completely internalized that. And so it's I feel like at this point it's so deeply entrenched that people kind of that's what leads to some of the disunity in Hinduism. But at the same time, I feel like social media and the rise of social media has provided us with an unprecedented opportunity that I think is very important to take, about getting the truth out, getting the word out, and getting to be able to influence a large number of people the way leftist education and kind of British education was able to do. And what do you think about that?
I think you've hit it right on the head. The education system is absolutely necessary in sort of changing the narrative that's being taught. On someone had commented on my on one of my videos is that one of the reasons for the state of Hinduism in India and worldwide is because Hinduism is not being taught. And I agreed, but they sort of said that like Hinduism has to be taught in schools. And I said, well, the first thing that you should probably do is that parents now need to take it upon themselves that like I have to educate myself so that I can educate the next generation. And I find too often what happens, and you may notice this too, is that Indians, and I could talk about any type of Indian, whether you're West Indian or you're Indian from India or South Africa, for so long the focus has been on you need to get a good education so that you can get a good job, so that you can make the most money, and anything to do with culture and Hinduism or anything like that. Oh, we don't need to worry, right? And that's the problem I find is that if more Indians, regardless of your background, if more of them were to take the attitude that my education, whether it be for my job, is just as important as educating myself on my own Hindu history. And that is, I think, what has primarily led to sort of like the downfall in a lot of Indians sort of internalizing the proper narrative that they should be when it comes to understanding their own culture, understanding their own religion. The focus has been too much on advancing myself materially in this world to the detriment of the culture that they're a part of. That same culture that gave them the brains, that gave them the genetics, that gave them everything to succeed in the world is the same thing that they're turning their back against right now. And that's what always makes me laugh. You know, I think about the ancient rishis, and like you read so much about, you know, what they did to understand the mind and the brain and the body. And I think this is the same people that are your ancestors. So you come from the same blood, you come from the same genes. So you have the brains to understand your culture, but you're not. You're going to focus on becoming the next best doctor or the next best engineer, which is fine. I mean, I have no problems with people trying to advance themselves, but at the same time, you can't forget everything that brought you to where you are today. So education is key, and if it's not happening in the school system, then it needs to happen at the home level. And if you can't do it at the home, then at least like the temples that are close to your home, you know, you need to start making an effort to attend. And if they don't have classes, start classes. There's so much material that is available that can actually teach young Hindus that we now have access to, as you're saying, because of social media, because of the rise of the internet. There's no reason why young Hindus today can't be educating themselves.
That's very true. And one of the things that I've noticed with Hindus as well, and this kind of follows up on one of the videos that you did that I really enjoyed as well. It was about the video that you did about Miley Cyrus, and she was, I think, celebrating either Saraswati Puja or Durga Puja.
She had posted photos on Instagram about Lakshmi Puja.
Lakshmi Puja, that's the one. And
yeah.
It was very interesting, the point you made, and it really resonated with me because it rings so true for Indians in India too, because it's when, say, a Westerner takes an interest or appreciates or praises a part of your culture or a part of your tradition, Hindus often take that as the real affirmation of their culture, and that's when they take pride in their culture and their traditions. And I see that so much in India, is that when for example a British scholar or an American scholar comes up and says, okay, this is what is good about India, then Indians will go on the whole chest thumping jamboree, and they're going to be like, okay, now our culture is fantastic. It's kind of strange that a culture as ancient and as rich as ours is, it doesn't have that inherent sense of pride that I was very fortunate enough to develop from a very young age. I think a large measure of that is how my parents raised me and how they taught me about my history and about my culture. But it's kind of crazy that we look to the West for approval for a culture that is so much more older and so much more broader in philosophy and in content than the West.
You know what? That video that I made was actually so I had just started my YouTube experience, and I think I was getting ready to go out or something like that, and like this thing sort of came across my Instagram feed, and I'm like, all right, let me just do a video off the cuff, like just talking off the top of my head. And that video, it's been about a year since I've been doing videos on YouTube. That video actually had the most likes and shares of any one of the videos that I've done, because I think it speaks to the volume of how many Indians don't value the traditions that they're a part of. And I can't understand it. And actually, if you go on YouTube right now and you look at the videos about Hinduism that actually has the most views, there's one that's about how Will Smith is now a Hindu, or who's Julia Roberts.
Roberts.
Yeah, so there's like a video. If you do a search for like your videos, you do a search for mine on like the column side is like the next recommended video is how Will Smith and Julia Roberts are Hindus, and it has like 300,000 views.
Yep.
Right. And like the stuff you're doing, like the stuff I'm doing, it's kind of like, okay, 300 views, 400 views. You're like, all right, people only want to talk about, as you rightfully said, as I said in my video, is that only when outsiders view what we are about, then all of a sudden that's when it becomes important, and that's a shame. That's really a sad state of affairs, is that it shouldn't take outsiders to make you realize what you have right in front of you. And I think if more Hindus, more Indians were to kind of pay attention to what's right in front of their noses, like half the problems that Hindus are facing right now probably wouldn't even exist.
I completely agree, and I think that's changing as well. That whole perception is changing little by little as well. Like, if you can see that on social media, for all the ills that social media has, one of the benefits of social media is that you can see that tide turning slowly, where Indians on social media, particularly Hindus on social media, are educating themselves through the medium of social media about their culture, and can hear people like you and me talk, and are kind of informed more and more about their culture, and are now developing that intrinsic pride in their culture as well. So I think that's a good development, and slowly that tide is changing. And it brings me to an interesting question as well, because people ask this question all the time, and because people use the word religion for Hinduism very often.
Mm-hmm.
That Hinduism is a religion, and the problem is that the word religion is often understood in the Abrahamic sense, because whenever you say the word religion, the first thing you think is, okay, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and then you say Hinduism, which is also a religion. So is Hinduism a religion? Is Hinduism a way of life? Is Hinduism something in between? Or is Hinduism something completely different entirely?
So I've been meaning to do a video on this because many people have commented on some of the videos. Yeah, so anytime we talk about Hinduism, language becomes very important, like
Yep.
the words we choose. So is Hinduism a religion in the strict sense of the word of what we mean by religion? And I believe religion comes from Latin, religos or something that means to like bind. So in the strict sense of the word and how people understand the word religion, Hinduism, no, is not a religion in that sense of the word. Now, is Hinduism like just a way of life? And I've asked people this that have argued against me, saying Hinduism is not a religion, it's a way of life. So then I turn it back on them and I'm like,
Right.
so what do you mean by way of life? Then and then they can't answer it, because to say that Hinduism is a way of life is really not saying anything, because being a vegetarian is a way of life. Being a bodybuilder is a way of life. Being someone who likes to read books all the time is a way of life. It doesn't tell me anything. So, when I encountered this question many years ago, I was actually reading one of the articles in Hinduism Today, and one of the swamis actually said that to understand Hinduism, I think we have to say it's a little bit of both. It's a religion in the sense that it consists of a set of practices. It consists of a set of ways to understand the world that we are in and our place in the world, and our place in the world. It's a way of life because it teaches you how to live in the world that you're living in. It teaches you the foods you have to eat, how to train your mind, how to live, how to start a family, how to live a householder life, which is the basic unit of a Hindu way of life. So I think it's both. But whenever we talk about it, we simply just can't say no, it's not a religion, or yes, it's just a way of life. We actually have to spend a little bit more time to qualify what we mean by these words. So I would say it's a little bit of both. To not call it a religion, I think also is doing it a disservice,
Right.
because it teaches you a way to sort of communicate with the divine that is in the world. It's not a religion in the sense that you have to accept everything blindly by faith, or because a book says it, therefore it must be true. It's a way to question. And I think one of the most beautiful things about Hinduism is that questioning has never been looked down upon.
Right.
If you read something and you don't agree with it, question it, and then would say, well, inquire on your own. So I think it's a little bit of both. Now, some people might say, well, that's a little bit of a cop out, but I think in the context of the world that we're living in right now, you can't say that it's a way of life, because I think that's just a nonsense answer that doesn't tell me anything. But it's a religion as well, because it also teaches you ways to be spiritual in the world.
I think I agree, and I think you raised a very good point about questioning and how Hinduism allows for that questioning to happen. Because if you look at examples like Mahavir, somebody who questioned the kind of established philosophy, established ethos, Mahavir is widely celebrated as a saint in India among Hindus. You look at Buddha. Buddha was somebody who again questioned the established philosophy and the status quo. And again, Buddha is somebody who is widely recognized as a saint and regarded as a saint, and everybody and their mother has a Buddha statue in their house. And you compare that to people who questioned, or people who asked questions, or people who doubted in religions other than Hinduism, like Islam and Christianity, for example, and they were either burnt at the stake or beheaded.
Yeah.
And that's a very key difference. You can question Hindu thought, you can question Hindu ethics, and you've been able to do that for millennia without that fear that somebody's going to roll up at your door, drag you out of your house, and murder you. And I think that speaks volumes for this religion and the democratic design that this religion has inherently built into it. And it grinds my gears so much when people online or people wherever, and it's just a very famous popular phrase for left intellectuals or intellectuals in general and the media, and maddeningly among Hindus as well. This is a very popular phrase when they say all religions are exactly the same.
Oh, yeah.
They're all exactly the same. Everything's is the same, and religious people say so. Atheists say so. And I don't know if you've heard of this guy called Sam Harris.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a very prominent, he's a neurosurgeon, a very prominent atheist, and somebody like him who eschews all religion entirely. Even somebody like him will accept that there are some really good aspects to cultures like Hinduism and cultures like Buddhism, whereas in cultures like Christianity and Islam, generally speaking, the damage that has been done to humanity by the religious content of Christianity and Islam overshadows by a country mile the good that is provided to humanity by these religions. Whereas when it comes to Hinduism, I think he concedes that there is a lot of good that can be offered, and it just completely drives me up a wall when I hear this phrase that every religion is the same, and you hear it everywhere.
That this is a true story. So being part of a Mandir atmosphere and growing up in Canada, there's a lot of these interfaith gatherings that you go to. So I've been to a few of them myself, and this was prior to me being a lot more vocal in Hinduism. So I went, and I forget who was the pundit that was there, or someone was speaking, and they're like, and they go up, they take the mic, and they say, Hindus believe that all religions are the same.
Oh,
so
goodness.
I think I was in high school. And like I heard this. And then I'm like, somehow, like, that statement in itself cannot make sense. Like, so then I went home and I was just thinking about this thing, and like at that time in my life, like I couldn't figure out how do I fight back against that. Like I could not understand. Okay, something inside me is not sitting right, because if all religions are the same, then why do I have to pray to Lord Shiva for? Because if all religions are the same, then we don't need to have different religions. And fast forward, I think I was now in my late 20s, and I actually had the opportunity to meet Rajiv Malhotra, actually.
Oh, wow.
And I had organized a seminar with him without even like really knowing what he was doing, and he came to speak about this book, Being Different.
Right.
So I actually bought that book, and the first few pages of that book like literally changed my life. It's just because he himself was nailed it on the head about the uneasiness Hindus have in trying to assert their difference. And he talks about his experience in the early 90s, actually, about trying to combat this whole thing about Hindu sameness. And little did I know that, like, I'm a teenager, in the 90s, that like I'm trying to like wrap my head around this thing. And little did I know that so many Hindus were basically like saying the same thing without really understanding what it meant. And reading that book, Being Different, literally changed my life, because it showed, how it is okay to be different. There's nothing wrong in having other religions, and I think you would also agree that India has been the home to many different religions, has welcomed people of the Jewish faith, of the Parsi faith, people that were basically persecuted, but for Hindus to go and parrot this thing about the world is one family, and that when I hear that, there, there was a Hindu youth conference that I attended. I had organized a group of youth here. It was about three years ago, and there was a Swami. There was like a youth leader, and someone had asked them about so how do Hindus view other faiths? And literally, one of the Swamis there like got up and said, "You know what? Hindus view God as one." So I'm sitting there now, and I like got
Oof.
livid. I like stood up and I'm like, I have to say something here. And I said, how can you sit here and tell all these young kids that are trying to understand the Hindu identity that every religion is the same? You're not helping their cause. You're just confusing them more. There's nothing wrong in asserting your difference. Being different doesn't mean that you're better than someone. And I think a lot of the problems Hindus have is that they're afraid to assert their difference because they think that raises their ego, that they're saying, because I'm different, I'm better. But
Right,
what we're saying is that I'm different. That is all. I am different. There's nothing
right.
wrong in being different. And I'm glad you raised that point, and I'm glad more people are starting to fight back against this whole all religions are the same nonsense. It's utter nonsense. It's garbage.
It really is, and it is possible. It is completely possible that the world is one family. It's possible, but even if you look at a family, people within one family can be very different from each other. There could be one sibling in a family that goes on to become an engineer at Google, and there is one person in a family that just becomes a trust fund baby and just sits at home. So within a family, there can be massive differences as well. So it is okay that you're different. And I think it's a great point that, you're not trying to say that you're better than somebody else. You're just trying to say that you're different, and there is a great value in that difference that you have. And that is what makes you unique. When people come to India, when foreigners visit India, they're not coming to visit an Islamic country. Because if they wanted to do that, they could have gone to Qatar, they could have gone to UAE, they could have gone to, a bunch of different countries, Jordan, wherever. And they're not coming to visit a Christian country. They could have gone to Europe for that. They are coming to experience Hinduism, essentially, when they come to India. They're coming to experience a culture that is completely different from any culture out there existing today. And that is what they come to experience. That is why when people come to India, they are blown away and they're always like, I have never seen anything like this in my life. And it's incredible. I have welcomed so many people. There's this place called Pushkar in Western India, in the state called Rajasthan. And I used to live in Delhi, and Delhi is not very far away from Pushkar. So I used to go to Pushkar very often. And Pushkar is very popular among foreign tourists, particularly, European tourists. And I would go there and I would often sit down and talk to a lot of foreigners, foreign tourists. And every single one of them would tell me the same exact story, that I came here expecting something, not sure what, but everything that I expected what I've experienced is completely different from what I've expected, essentially. And this is like nowhere else in the world. And that's something to take a lot of pride in. And it's not
Absolutely.
something to deflect away. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally agree. Coming to India actually is something that is on my radar, but I'm not sure when it will actually happen.
Right.
I know there are many West Indians that actually have gone. I have a few friends here that were able to trace their ancestry actually. So when the Indians came over on the boats and the ship records were actually, and I think you have to give credit to the British. They actually maintain pretty good
Right.
records. So there are some friends that I have here whose parents were able to actually go and actually look at the village that their ancestors came from and actually go to India
Wow.
and visit those villages there. My own great grandfather came from India, and I was actually talking to my dad and my uncle about this. So my uncle did try to actually trace back. I know that so my ancestors came from UP actually.
Oh, wow.
but when my uncle actually tried to like get to the actual village, what he was told was that the village that my ancestors came from was actually wiped out in a flood.
Oh,
So they weren't actually able to go any further than that. But you know, maybe one of these days I'll have a chance to visit India.
absolutely, man. If you want, and whenever you're in there, if you should let me know, and if I'm there, I'll show you the time of your life.
Yeah, you know what? I know my wife and myself. You know, we're very interested in actually doing it. As to when it will happen, I hope it happens sooner rather than later.
No, absolutely, and that'll be fantastic. And that kind of brings me, it again, it boggles my mind that somebody like yourself, who was not born in India but has maintained that culture, and you're so eager to go back to India and to assert sort of your Hindu identity and who you are. And I see the opposite in so many young people, my age, for example. A lot of like educated urban Hindus, whether in India or in the West, they are so quick to shy away from their Hindu identity. They're so quick to shy away from calling themselves Hindus, even. And when people ask them, Where are you from?" They're just like, "Oh, India, but I'm American now, or I'm this now." And there's absolutely nothing wrong with being American or being Canadian. I think that's great that when you immigrate to a country that you identify as a person of that country. But to run away from your Hindu heritage, you might not be Indian essentially, but I feel like to run away from your Hindu heritage is very weird.
Yeah,
Again, talking with all this stuff that we talked about belonging to such a unique culture, but the educated folk, tend to run away from it, and the so-called folk in the smaller towns and the villages are more proud of it than the educated people are, and it's such a strange thing, isn't it?
yeah. I totally agree with you. And you know, just speaking to that point, a lot of the Indians that left India were actually the village folk that actually left. Um, and you know, I sometimes I scratch my head and I try to understand the Hindu mindset, and sometimes I really don't have an answer. Like I really don't have an answer, and I don't know what has to be done to kind of flick that switch to turn the light bulb on for Hindus to have that light bulb moment that, you know what, if I don't fight for what I believe in, it's going to be lost. And I think if Hinduism, you know, gets digested into like Western culture, that will be a detriment to the world that we live in. I really believe so, which is why like I think guys like yourself, guys, you know, that are willing to kind of take the time and effort to sort of like, you know, speak out about what's going on, you know, that those small little things go a long way. You know what? We may not have like 500,000 people watching our videos. You
Right.
know, but even if there's one person that sort of gets inspired by what you're doing, then you know what? That in itself would be a success. Um,
I couldn't agree more. I think that's a very important point, and I think the best way to fight it is again leverage social media to your advantage. It's such an unprecedented opportunity. Again, like I mentioned before, that it is criminal almost not to take it. And and it brings me to another question, because I often see, in the West, I see this in India all the time, and again, it drives me up a bloody wall, but I see this in the West a lot as well. And it relates to one of the videos that you did in which you were talking about Superwoman, who is, a YouTuber of Indian descent, and Jagmeet Singh, who I believe is a leader for a Canadian political party. Is that correct?
yes, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and they were talking about how Raksha Bandhan is a sexist
Mhm.
festival, and you see that so much in India, and you see that so much in the West as well. Particularly when it comes to Hindus, is that Hindu traditions are sexist, and Hindu beliefs are patriarchal, and everything that a Hindu does is steeped in this patriarchy and this caste dominance struggle. And that scrutiny and that criticism, for some reason, never goes to Islam. I notice that in America all the time. I notice that in India all the time. I'm not very aware of what the popular discourse in Canada is like and what the media in Canada is like with that. But I bet that the situation in Canada is not that different.
It's basically the same. Like whatever narrative is part of the American media is the same narrative that exists here, and it's unfortunate. That video that I did on Superwoman and Jagmeet Singh, it really bothered me when I saw Jagmeet Singh posting that on his Twitter feed, because it just goes to show that if your understanding of a Hindu tradition is coming from a Western point of view that is viewing it through a Western lens, then of course you could say anything is sexist, and you could say that patriarchy, is permeates everything. But I mean, what understanding of the tradition do we have, and is your understanding hinged on a like postmodernist interpretation of Hinduism? And I mean, we can see right now that postmodernism is actually, is a detriment to the society that we're living in. Like, there's a lot of stuff that people are now pushing back against, which is good to see. But to have like people like Jagmeet Singh, a leader of a national party, coming out and saying this thing, like he is basically painting everyone that chooses to celebrate that tradition in one sort of sweep of his brush. Everyone is now participating in a patriarchal practice, and that I did not like at all, one bit. And it's funny that you mentioned that video, because if you watch that video, I did not talk about Sikhism. I did not talk about Khalistan. I did not.
That's a problem brewing in Canada, and that's a major criticism of. Yeah. Go ahead.
No. So I chose not to talk about any of those things. I just chose to talk about someone who is a leader of a national party talking about the Raksha Bandhan from that point of view. But when I did that video, right away, like the views went up. But then the comments got talking about how I was attacking Sikhism, and how that I'm against Sikhs, and I'm like, nowhere did I say that at all. Like, I have nothing against Sikhs. The video was not against him as a Sikh. The video was not against Superwoman as a Sikh. The video was against painting a tradition that Sikhs and Hindus participate in as something that it is not, a sexist tradition. But then all the comments became about Khalistan and this and that, and I'm like, oh my God.
Right. This is not, this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about, and I find this whole thing very interesting as well, is because in India, you notice something very funny about the relationship between Hindus and Sikhs. So whenever there's a cultural event in, say, Delhi, where there's a lot of Sikhs and Hindus that live together, whenever there's a cultural event like a Durga Puja or something like that, Hindus and Sikhs will always show up together, and Sikhs will always be there praying together and celebrating the puja together. But when it comes to it's just when it comes to political issues and election issues and things like that, that Sikhs are just adamant about maintaining a separate identity. And I feel like that kind of has translated to Canada in a large way as well, where Sikhs are just adamant to maintain this separate identity from Hindus, whereas there is no way to refute that Sikhs and Hindus are children of the same mother.
Yes,
go ahead.
I totally agree with that statement. Like, I have a lot of Sikh friends. I've been to Sikh weddings. I've been to gurdwaras here. I have no issue with Sikhs whatsoever.
Sorry, Shawn, just to cut you off there. Your sound's crackling in my ear a little bit. Is it crackling in yours too?
What about now?
It's crackling a little bit as well. Still.
I haven't changed anything.
Okay. Well, no worry. It's not that bad. It's just a little bit of a crackle.
Okay. Let's see.
Yeah, it's better now, actually.
Okay. It may have just been static in the bandwidth.
Possibly. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Khalistan movement here. I am trying so hard to stay away from all of those politics and
Right.
everything else. But the more you start to assert a Hindu identity, like people from all walks of life start coming in, and they want to come in and sort of like change the narrative about what you're about. You know, it's unfortunate that the Air India bombing here that happened in Canada, 1984, I believe. You know, that was a very, you know, big. That was the largest terrorist act that happened here in Canada, and to see where like this, you know, where the politics of that have gone in sort of recent months, and the rise of people like Jagmeet Singh,
Right.
you know, that's a whole other issue. I just hope that, you know, if he does rise in politics, that his views about Hinduism, you know, he doesn't try to paint Hindus in a bad light, because that would certainly be to the detriment of the party that he's a part of. And you know, just, you know, if I could do a YouTube video that resonates with a few of the Hindus to make them realize that Raksha Bandhan is not a sexist tradition, then I will continue making videos like that.
Exactly, and it's a weird one too, because you know the concept of Raksha Bandhan is that a brother, you know, ties, or a sister ties a Rakhi or a Raksha Bandhan to her brother, and it is seen often as, you know, now people see it as now the sister is somehow under the brother's control. But that's not the concept behind it. The concept behind is that the brother vows to protect her no matter what. And for some reason, I don't understand, if a brother vows to protect his sister no matter what happens, how is that a sexist or a patriarchal thing? I mean, it's not that the sister will not protect the brother no matter what. If something befell the brother, for example, if the brother was in an accident, it's not that the sister is not going to take care of him. And if the sister says that, hey, you know, if you get into an accident, or if anything happens to you, or if you're ever in trouble, I will protect you. Now, does that become sexist as well? So it's a strange concept, you know, that a pure emotion between a brother and sister is now construed as some sort of an insidious patriarchal plot to control women.
Yep, and there's a lot of that, actually, you know, in trying to reinterpret Hindu scriptures. I had a conversation with a youngster this morning about, you know, if you read about Mother Sita in the Ramayana, and you read about how, you know, feminist portrayals of her as someone that was you know, that was abused by Ravan, and that was like discarded by Sri Ram, and all of these like crazy interpretations. Like I just told him, like, be wary of what you read, because like they would have all these crazy interpretations, and you're just like reading this thing, and you're like, what are they talking about?
What is going on?
What are they talking about? So yeah, it really makes me laugh.
Definitely, it's a crazy one, and you know, Hindus get a lot of. I feel like it's a fashionable thing these days to kind of demonize Hindus and Hinduism in the media. It happens all the time in India, and I wonder how much of that happens in for example, Canada, because one thing that happens in India a lot is that every single Hindu tradition will be scrutinized and criticized and demonized, whereas if there's a Muslim tradition, for example, a Muslim woman who is required to wear a veil, or a Muslim woman, you know, with the whole triple talaq issue and all of that stuff, those are considered as, oh, that's their tradition. You know, let them be. Don't interfere with somebody else's tradition. And there's this phrase that is used often in this case. It's called soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yes.
Now, I'm not sure who coined this phrase, but some of the people that I listen to, for like Majid Nawaz, who's an Islamist reformer, he uses this phrase very much, because he says that when it comes to certain cultures, everything is fair game. But when it comes to other cultures, like leave them alone because that's their culture. And that's kind of a racism towards that culture as well, because you're almost assuming that that culture is not capable of change, or the people in that culture are some Stone Age savages that are not capable of change and reform.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up, and I think that kind of relates to, in a sense that here in Canada, I really feel that Hinduism is not on anyone's radar.
Right.
Like we are so small, we are so minuscule that no one really even pays attention to us. The only time we get any type of attention is when it's election time and politicians have to come and get votes.
Yep.
And then you see politicians coming to the temple, they're saying namaste, and they're doing all of this. But in reality, we really have not captured the mindset of anyone. However, the funny thing is that you talk about yoga, and then all of a sudden, everyone's eyes kind of picks up, because yoga is something that has been disassociated from Hindu tradition, and that has taken on a life of its own. And you will know that yoga as practiced in the West is not really what yoga is really about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a topic for that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, and I think it's an important point that you make about yoga too, because it's and the whole point about it being completely divorced from Hinduism, and I feel like some blame of that I think Hindus have to take themselves as well, because it's in a way it's just bad branding and bad kind of marketing on the part of Hindus. I feel like we should be in a situation where, or we could be in the future in a situation where Hindus are, we can make ourselves, if we just brand ourselves better, to become the authority on yoga, for example. That if somebody really needed to learn yoga, if you really want to learn yoga, if you really want to know what this is all about, then you come to a Hindu, you learn from a Hindu. So I feel like there's some branding problems there as well. And my last actually question to you is people often lump Hindus together with other cultures, particularly Muslims, and there's a lot of confusion in a, for example, a lay American about what a Hindu is and what a Muslim is, and most people think of them as the same exact thing, that there's no really discernible difference between a Hindu and a Muslim. And I feel like when it comes to and what also kind of feels strange to me is that Hindus take it. They're often completely okay with being lumped with Muslims, and that I feel like when it comes to things like immigration, I think that's something that really hurts Hindus at the end of the day as well, because I think in almost every case, overwhelmingly, Hindus make model immigrants, because when they go to a country, they are often one of the most educated people in the country. They're often very well read. They often earn very well. They often, on average, I think in the US, the immigrant group that has the highest average income are Indians and Hindus, and they make an effort to integrate into the culture. And thirdly, you will never see a Hindu gang roaming the streets of America. I mean, you will see a Russian gang, you will see Chinese gangs, you will even see Korean gangs and Vietnamese gangs, but you will never see a Hindu gang. And I think it's important. I think it's to our benefit to Hindus to kind of differentiate themselves from Muslims as well, and not just be okay with getting lumped together with them. What do you think about that?
You know what? Someone has, so in relation to that, so someone asked. So one of my coworkers told me that they were going to an Indian wedding.
Right.
So
this is going.
So I looked at them and I said, "So you're going to an Indian wedding?" And I had to explain to them. I'm like, "There's no such thing as an Indian wedding. Are you going to a Muslim wedding? Are you going to a Sikh wedding? Are you going to a Hindu wedding? Or you could even be going to a Christian wedding." An Indian wedding is a misnomer, because Indians are by and can comprise so many different people. And I think, see, the funny thing, that you bring them up is that a Hindu has no problem welcoming people into their fold.
Mm-hmm.
But you ask people of other cultures to do the same thing, and that is not given back to them, and it's a shame.
Yep,
And it's
I agree.
a shame. Like a Hindu would be willing to welcome anyone into their home and call them their brother, but people of other faiths don't want to do that. And I think Hindus have to start asserting their identity without a doubt. Like Hindus have to start asserting their own identity. Yes, the majority of Hindus are Indian, but Hindus on a whole have to not be afraid, to start, really internalizing that religion, that way of life, that culture that they're a part of. It's the whole Hindu-Muslim conflict. You know what? Like it started in India, and I can tell you point blank that in the Caribbean, it still exists. I know stories that my in-laws have told me, that my parents have mentioned as well. Now that's not to say like Hindus, like I have Muslim friends. But the constant battle between Hindus and Muslims in India, will it ever come to an end?
Wow, that's the $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's. I think it can, but I think it is going to need some sort of a reformation on the part of the Muslims. It's coming in a very, very minuscule way. You can see it already. There's a lot of Islamic reformers that are now finally braving all these threats to make their voices heard. So it's a tiny little spark, but that's what you need initially. You need a little spark from somewhere. So it's coming. It might be years away, it might be decades away, it might be a century away, but I think it's coming. And until that happens, I don't see any sort of reconciliation, at least in my view.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is sort of going off into other things now,
Sure.
but the Muslim experience in the Caribbean, I was talking to a few friends about this months ago, is that the Muslim experience, the Muslim Caribbean experience, so that those that came from India that were Muslim, and when they settled in the Caribbean, a lot of their practices actually borrow from Hindu traditions, whether it be like the sharing of prasad or anything like that. Actually, like a lot of culturally how they practice in the West Indies actually borrows from Hindu traditions. And I actually found that very fascinating because I think the more moderate Muslims, if you want to call them that, are open to sort of different ways of expressing their faith. But we see that there's this hardline, like Saudi brand of Islam that is sort of taking over the world.
Right.
And I think that it's unfortunate that that's the brand of Islam that is getting spread when I personally feel that Indian Muslims are very different and should
I agree with that.
And should be very different from the Saudi brand of Islam as is practiced. And I think Indian Muslims, do have a lot to share the world, but how many of them are willing to put their, neck out and be willing to fight back? That's the problem.
That's the problem. That's the problem. I think it's a great point that you raise, and I think like I said again, that we're seeing some people starting to put their necks out, and what is incumbent upon us as kind of secularists, I think it's incumbent upon people like us, and it's incumbent upon secularists in the West who claim to be liberals and who claim to be actual secularists, to give these people the support they need, because they're not going to get support from their communities. They're going to need support from us. They're going to need support from the West, and they're going to need support from the so-called liberals around the world as well. And I think that's a great point. And I think on that note, I understand that it's getting late and you might have to run soon. Yeah, no, so I completely understand that. Again, on that point, I must again thank you and tell you how much I appreciate you doing this. You're the first guest on the Sham Sharma Show sessions, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
No, you know what? When you reached out to me, I was like, you know what? We need to start doing more of this. So yeah, no, thank you for inviting me. I'll be sure to share the link of this video on all my social media feeds. And I wish you, you know, all the best. I wish there's more people like you. And I think all of us have to really support each other to actually, you know, make our voices be heard. Whether you're an Indian Hindu, a West Indian Hindu, Canadian Hindu, there's a lot to be said for all of us coming together and supporting each other. I have a video in the works that I wanted to share with your viewers as well. So you know, you speak a lot about Indian politics, about how, you know, what's happening in India, and I've told many of my own friends that I actually keep well abreast to the politics of India, and many of them turn to ask me why. They're like, "You're not from India. You're from, you know, you're born in Canada. You are of a West Indian background. Why aren't you paying attention to like politics in Trinidad?" So I turned to them and I said, "Are you a Hindu?" And they said, "Yes." So I said, "Which is the country that Hinduism originated from?" And they said, "India." And I said, "If you're a Hindu, then you should care about what happens in India, regardless of like the, you know, what's going on, like the details of like what's going on. But I think Hindus, if you are a Hindu, you should care about what's happening in India, because that is the land that our tradition came from. And I would hate to see something happen to that country. Now, I may not be of, you know, I don't hold an Indian passport or anything like that, but I certainly care about the Hindu cause. And I think Hindus around the world need to start focusing more on what's happening in India and support those that are there that can actually make a difference.
I think that's such a good point because, you know, if you look at Muslims, you know, you say, oh, Muslims. If you think of a Muslim homeland, you could think of 30 different countries. If you think of a Christian homeland, you could think of 30 different countries. But if you think of a Hindu homeland, there is only one country out there. And our culture and our, you know, aspects of our religion and our history is so intricately and so, you know, irreplaceably tied with that country and its geography that, you know, if anything happens to a country, to that country, a whole chunk of that culture will just completely lose context of, you know, because if you look at a lot of the Vedas and if you look at a lot of the earlier ancient works, they were set in and around northwestern India, what is currently northwestern India, and a large part of that was set in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So you when you read those things, your mind, in your heart, you weep a little bit because that part of your history and that part of your geography that was so intricately linked to that land is just gone. And you know, we've allowed that to happen once, and we cannot allow that to happen again.
Again, yep. I totally agree.
Yeah, and I agree with this as well. And I think that's I think that's a great point or a great way to end today's show. Again, Shawn, thanks very much for doing this, mate. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
And you guys, if you're watching this, if you're still with us, thank you very much, first of all. And you can check out Shawn's Twitter and Shawn's YouTube channel in the link provided below. His YouTube channel is called Hindu Lifestyle. It is fantastic. It is very well done. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And again, thanks very much, Shawn. And thank you very much, guys, for watching today's episode. My name is Sham Sharma, and I will see you soon.